Sekhukhune elected new executive members. The Limpopo region held a two-day elective conference. Sekhukhune District Municipality Executive Mayor Stan Ramaile failed to retain his position as chair. The majority of votes went to Julia Matebe. Mina Bahule was elected deputy regional chair, while Matope Tala took the regional secretary position. The ANC Limpopo chair, also the province's premier, Stan Matabata, has urged those who lost the elections to rally behind the victors as a sign of discipline and unity. The KwaZulu-Natal ANC says it wants to ask the ANC's national leadership to allow it to join the court application brought by former President Jacomb Zuma to appeal the decision that he must go back to jail. On Wednesday, the High Court in Tshwane ruled that Arthur Fraser's decision to release Zuma on medical parole was illegal because he had overruled the Medical Parole Board with no valid medical reason. Now the ANC KZN says it wants to join Zuma's application to appeal that decision because it's worried there could be more violence in that province if he does go back to jail. Professor Barry Hanyane is a professor of politics at Northwest University. He joins us now. Professor Hanyane, good afternoon to you. I mean, on the law, this would seem to be a difficult argument to make. We don't want someone to go to jail because there'll be other consequences that have nothing to do with the actual law of the application. But in reality, I imagine the KZN ANC is very, very worried about what could happen. It reminds us about what did happen.
Stephen, good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to your viewers. Look, I think the ANC is taking a rather sympathetic, more appeasing kind of a position on this matter. It's trying to occupy and exploit the space of wanting to perhaps bring the factions within KZN under the same roof. So in a way, becoming its own arbiter of the kinds of divisive politics within that province. And I don't think it's a good strategy. Surely issues of ethics here run at the center of this debacle, but more so the issue of leadership. Why is it so impossible for KZN ANC to say, let's allow the rule of law to take its course? And in this instance, they should not be seen to be rather openly critical of the judicial system. And in a sense, fall back. Surely there are other means of ensuring that there is unity within the ANC in the province, but more so, that initiative brings with it a sense of certainty, a sense of safety, if you want, to avoid any recurrence of the July anarchy that we saw. To then suggest that the anarchy was primarily due to the incarceration of the former President Zuma, I think it's a touch too much. Surely there were extenuating factors that contributed to the July chaos, the issue of poverty, the issue of criminality as well. So why reduce it to a particular incident and use that as a pretext to say the former president must not go back to jail? I think it's a wrong step on the direction of ensuring that politics becomes the winner at the end of the day.
I may be on the wrong track here, but I wondered, when the KwaZulu-Natal ANC says, we want to ask the national leadership if we can have permission, as the KZN can have permission, to join this case. What they're really trying to do is to say to the national leadership, we want you, as a national leadership, to join the case. Do you think that may be the intention here, that maybe they're trying to put a little bit of pressure on the NEC?
Yeah, well, look, it could be a number of factors, Stephen. I think one of them is to exploit that leadership vacuum that exists at national level. Remember, the ANC doesn't have the SG's office operating optimally. So that is a vacuum on its own, let alone the divided members of the NEC, others perhaps not so keen at showing publicly the support towards the former president, others being sympathetic. So it's a way of again, highlighting those fault lines and perhaps bringing on board some sympathizers on the side of the KZN ANC constituency. And I don't see merit in that, seeing that, look, why would an organization be involved in legal matters that involves a former president and, of course, a member of the party itself who has legal issues and not necessarily party political matters that would put his membership in some kind of question? So it's quite interesting how the KZN views this, and given the intention, but I think it's a question of exploiting what is the weakness currently of the ANC's national leadership.
Well, I mean, there's so many different things here. I mean, I can imagine someone in KZN, I'm not in KwaZulu-Natal, saying, look, we need to do something because we need to show our people, the people who live here, that we're trying to stop this violence happening again. And I can imagine that argument in some communities going some way. But when you get so far below 50% in local elections, and you keep promising renewal, and then you say, we want to go and help this person that we are renewing ourselves against, or renewing ourselves from, or whatever the right English is, it's not going to help you in 2024, is it?
Stephen, rhetoric will not help the ANC. As a matter of fact, it was unfortunate that the little initiatives that were publicly demonstrated by its president, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, in taking ownership to the mistakes done by the majority party, and of course, putting the credibility of the party to public scrutiny. If you remember that open letter, taking responsibility. But again, it fell short of making sure that there's discipline, making sure that the resolutions that were undertaken in Nazareth, in totality, are implemented, and other initiatives, all in the name of modernizing the party. I think the ANC must understand they fall short of that. No wonder why the results of the 1st of November were so appalling. It was indeed not necessarily a wake-up call only, but a way in which South Africans spoke against the track record of the ANC, and of course the dismay that the public has towards its leadership, towards taking the country seriously, and of course projecting the country as a strong country globally.
There's another aspect here which I think is actually quite difficult to assess or examine, which is why I'm going to ask a professor of politics yourself about it, which is that Professor Zuma is a former president, has no formal power. Politics often isn't about formal power, but he has no formal power. There's no power of patronage. There's nothing that he can do on a transactional basis for someone. He can't give them a job. He speaks very seldom, certainly in public, in a way that's reported in the English-speaking media. And yet, here is a province of the governing party wanting to get involved in his court case. He's retaining this power quite effectively, perhaps.
Stephen, it's not surprising. The informal organization within the ANC is very strong. And I suppose if you take a step backwards a couple of years, when you used to have your so-called the Premier League, it was in a sense an attempt. It might be futile now, but there's still remnants of it being effective somewhat. It was an attempt to say it's okay to have factions, especially two dominant factions. And there's the narrative that says there are so many factions, there are so many franchises within the ANC, and that may hold water by and large. But here is a force to be reckoned with. Why would ANC KZN cede its influence to Eastern Cape, for instance, as the second biggest region, and then, of course, come Limpopo and other regions as well, and more so the influence of Gauteng? I think it's a question of a numbers game as well, coming into play to say status quo then, when Mr. Zuma was still at the helm, should have been kept in place. A succession plan should have been somewhat conjured up so that in the end, KZN remains a dominant force. I think that project has failed. However, you can't write it off altogether. Look at what happened in the negotiations for eThekwini, for instance. The politics of renting came to visit the ANC, in a way putting back the Zuma faction as the force to be reckoned with in the politics of that province. And I'm afraid this will put Zikalala's leadership in public question, not only within the ANC, but also within the broader scope of politics in that particular part of the country, as in provincially. So in a sense, the shifting fault lines are becoming more visible, albeit retaining that influence that the Zuma faction has in the province.
There's another question hanging over all of this around whether or not, and this is the sort of thing that makes this conversation so important and so powerful perhaps, is could the violence that we saw last year happen again, earlier? Could the violence that we saw in July happen again? And you've already alluded to certain issues that led to it. I mean, poverty, I would argue as well, perhaps, and I don't know if you'll agree, but let me put it to you, I would suggest that the fact that there have been lockdowns and the pandemic added to that as well. And the question really then becomes, is it possible that that could happen again? I think there's several reasons why maybe it couldn't. I think the SANDF would act more quickly. I think government would act more quickly. But that risk is still there. I think that's the great fear here.
And the counter risk, Stephen, is still there. People died. That fear still lingers on. That says if people were to voluntarily enter into a space of anarchy, either being instigators or being the perpetrators on the ground, their own lives are at risk. But more importantly is damage to property. It will be naive of us to only acknowledge damage that belongs to business and forget that some people who went to loot with their own personal cars lost some of those cars. And then, of course, there was the violence itself. So collectively, these sociosomatic effects on the part of those who might find themselves on the wrong side of the law might very well be the deterrent that pushes back those who would want to see the repeat of what happened in July.
Professor Hanyane, really appreciate the time, sir. Thank you very much indeed. A lot of wisdom there from the professor.